December 7, 1941 arrived with the silence of inevitability, but for Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the weight of what was about to unfold had been building for months. As he sat in the cockpit of his Nakajima B-5N bomber aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, somewhere in the dark expanse of the North Pacific, he understood that within hours, the course of history would pivot on the actions of the men around him. The strike force, designated Kido Butai, had maintained radio silence for 12 days, steaming through fog and rough seas toward a destination that represented both Japan's greatest gamble and what many believed to be its only path forward. The genesis of this moment stretched back far beyond the planning rooms of Tokyo. Japan's transformation from isolated archipelago to imperial power had been meteoric and costly. Following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the nation had modernized with breathtaking speed, studying Western powers even as it competed with them. Victory over China in 1895 and the stunning defeat of Russia in 1905 had announced Japan's arrival on the world stage. But empire demanded resources, and Japan's home islands possessed almost none. No oil, no rubber, no iron ore in sufficient quantities. Everything required to sustain a modern military machine had to be imported, and therein lay the trap that would lead to Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the coming attack, had walked the corridors of Harvard University and served as naval attaché in Washington. He knew America intimately, perhaps better than any senior officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. This knowledge filled him with foreboding rather than confidence. According to accounts documented in Gordon Prange's extensive research, At Dawn We Slept, Yamamoto had warned his superiors repeatedly that war with the United States would be catastrophic in the long term. He allegedly told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. Yet when the decision for war became inevitable, Yamamoto's duty demanded he make that first year as devastating as possible. The path to this moment had accelerated dramatically in the summer of 1941. Japan's invasion of China, beginning in 1937, had devolved into a brutal quagmire that consumed resources without resolution. The Imperial Army's seizure of French Indochina in July 1941 finally triggered the response Tokyo had feared. President Franklin Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States and, more critically, imposed a total oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed suit. Suddenly, Japan's oil reserves began ticking downward like a clock toward midnight. Military planners calculated that without access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within 2 years, the Navy immobilized within months. The Imperial Conference of September 6, 1941, attended by Emperor Hirohito, had set the final course. Diplomatic negotiations would continue, but if no breakthrough occurred by early October, war would be inevitable. When October passed without resolution, the machinery of conflict engaged with mechanical precision. On November 26th, the strike force sailed from Hidokapu Bay in the Kuriil Islands, each ship carrying men who understood they might not return. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai with the burden of a man who doubted his own mission. An officer of the old school, Nagumo had built his reputation in traditional surface warfare, not in the radical new doctrine of carrier aviation that Yamamoto championed. His flagship Akagi led a force unprecedented in naval history: 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, escorted by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. The carriers alone could launch over 400 aircraft, representing the most powerful concentration of naval air power ever assembled. The pilots who would fly these aircraft represented the finest product of Japan's brutal training regimen. Men like Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, who would lead the fighter escort, had logged thousands of flight hours. They had honed their skills over China, where Japanese aircraft had dominated the skies. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter they flew was, in late 1941, the most maneuverable fighter in the world, capable of outturning any opponent. Its pilots knew this and carried the confidence of proven superiority. Yet beneath the professionalism ran currents of deeper conviction. Japan's military culture had evolved from the samurai tradition of the Tokugawa period transformed but not abandoned during modernization. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized loyalty unto death, honor above life, and service to emperor as the highest calling. These were not merely slogans but beliefs internalized through years of indoctrination. Combined with the Shinto concept that the emperor was divine, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, service in his name took on transcendent meaning. The strategic calculation behind Pearl Harbor rested on psychological assumptions, as much as military ones. Yamamoto believed that Americans, accustomed to comfort and democracy's debates, would lack the stomach for a protracted Pacific War if dealt a sufficiently shocking blow. Sink the American battleships, the thinking went, and the United States would negotiate a settlement leaving Japan's conquered territories intact. It was a fundamental misreading of American character, but one that seemed reasonable to men who had studied American isolationist sentiment throughout the 1930s. As the strike force approached its launch point, the tension aboard the carriers became palpable. Intelligence reports had been encouraging. The American Pacific Fleet maintained a predictable schedule, with most capital ships in harbor on weekends. Reconnaissance suggested that as of December 3rd, 8 battleships were at Pearl Harbor. No carriers, unfortunately. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were at sea or in San Diego, but the battleships remained the primary targets. In 1941, many naval officers still believed battleships were the ultimate arbiters of sea power. On the evening of December 6th, Nagumo's force reached its launch point 230 miles north of Oahu. The seas were rough, waves breaking over the carrier's bows, but the weather over the target was forecast to be clear. In the ready rooms, air crews received their final briefings. They studied maps and models of Pearl Harbor, identifying targets with precision. The battleships moored along Ford Island's eastern shore, called Battleship Row, were primary objectives. Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, and other air bases had to be struck to prevent American aircraft from launching counterstrikes. Commander Fuchida would lead the first wave of 183 aircraft, 49 high-altitude bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighters. A second wave of 170 aircraft would follow an hour later. As midnight passed and December 7th began, the mechanics made final checks on engines that would carry Japan across the Rubicon. There would be no turning back. At 0600 hours on December 7th, the carriers turned into the wind and began launching aircraft. The deck crews, working with practiced efficiency despite the rolling seas, managed to get the first wave airborne by 0620. Commander Fuchida's bomber climbed into the pre-dawn darkness, forming up with the growing swarm of aircraft around him. As the formation completed, Fuchida set course for Oahu, 183 aircraft flying toward a target that had no idea they were coming. The flight south took approximately 90 minutes. Fuchida navigated by radio beacon, ironically using a Honolulu commercial radio station signal to guide the attack force directly to its target. As dawn broke over the Pacific, the pilots could see the island of Oahu emerging from the morning haze. The weather was indeed perfect, scattered clouds at 3,000 feet, visibility excellent. At 0740, Fuchida saw Pearl Harbor spread below him like a model. The battleships arranged in neat rows exactly where intelligence had predicted. The attack plan was choreographed with precision. If surprise was achieved, Fuchida would fire a single flare, signaling the torpedo bombers to attack first while fighters strafed the airfields. If surprise was lost, a different signal would send the dive bombers in first to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Fuchida observed the peaceful scene below, ships at rest, no unusual activity, no aircraft rising to intercept. At 0749, he fired a single flare. When the formation didn't respond immediately, he fired another. This created confusion, as some units interpreted 2 flares as the second signal, but it hardly mattered. Surprise was complete. At 0753, Fuchida transmitted the code that would echo through history. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The message, received aboard the Akagi, confirmed that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Even as Fuchida sent it, the first bombs were falling and torpedoes were churning toward their targets. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led the torpedo bombers in their dangerous low-level runs. The torpedoes they carried were marvels of engineering, modified with wooden fins to function in Pearl Harbor's shallow 40-foot depth, a feat American experts had believed impossible. The pilots, flying at barely 50 feet, threaded between ships and buildings to reach their attack positions. Murata himself targeted the battleship West Virginia, his torpedo slamming into her port side at 0757. The American response was brave but disorganized. Caught completely off guard, sailors raced to their battle stations, many still in pajamas. Some anti-aircraft guns were locked, their ammunition stored separately as a peacetime precaution. Aboard the battleship Nevada, a duty ensign managed to get the ship underway, the only battleship to do so during the attack. But this gallant effort nearly proved disastrous when Japanese pilots concentrated their attacks on her, hoping to sink her in the channel and block the harbor entrance. The battleship Arizona suffered the attack's most catastrophic hit. A Japanese bomb, likely dropped by a high-altitude bomber from either the Kaga or Akagi, penetrated her forward magazine at approximately 0810. The explosion was cataclysmic, lifting the 32,000-ton vessel partially out of the water. Over 1,000 men died instantly, trapped below decks or incinerated in the fireball. The Arizona settled to the harbor bottom within 9 minutes, taking most of her crew with her. For the Japanese pilots, the scene below was both exhilarating and terrible. They had trained for this moment, and their weapons were performing exactly as designed. Yet many would later recall the strange mixture of professional satisfaction and human horror at the destruction they wrought. At 0840, Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led the second wave toward Pearl Harbor. Unlike the first wave, which had enjoyed complete surprise, Shimazaki's 170 aircraft faced a different battlefield. Smoke from burning ships obscured targets. Anti-aircraft fire, initially sparse and confused, had intensified into a deadly curtain of steel. American gunners, recovering from their shock, poured fire into the sky with desperate fury. The second wave's composition reflected different tactical objectives. 54 high-altitude bombers targeted the naval yard and ships that had escaped serious damage. 80 dive bombers flying the Aichi D-3A Val struck at remaining ships and installations. 36 fighters provided cover and strafed targets of opportunity. The chaos of battle had fully descended on Pearl Harbor, and the clinical precision of the first wave gave way to the brutal confusion of combat. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, piloting a dive bomber, later recalled the intense anti-aircraft fire that greeted the second wave. Shells burst around his aircraft in black flowers of shrapnel. The Americans were fighting back now with everything they had. Abe watched as several Japanese aircraft, struck by anti-aircraft fire, spiraled into the harbor or crashed on land. The cost of the attack was mounting, though it remained remarkably light given the scale of destruction achieved. The dive bombers concentrated on ships the torpedo bombers had missed or damaged, but not sunk. The battleship Pennsylvania, in dry dock, and thus safe from torpedoes, received several bomb hits. The destroyers Cassin and Downs, in the same dry dock, were devastated by bombs and subsequent fires. The light cruiser Helena, the target ship Utah, and several other vessels suffered varying degrees of damage. But the harbor's infrastructure, the machine shops, dry docks, and especially the massive fuel tank farms, remained largely untouched. This would prove to be one of the attack's greatest strategic failures, though it wasn't apparent to the Japanese pilots that morning. The fuel tanks held 4.5 million barrels of oil, virtually the entire Pacific Fleet's reserve. Their destruction would have crippled American operations for months, perhaps longer. Yet the attack plan prioritized ships over infrastructure, a decision reflecting the battleship-centric thinking still dominant in naval circles. By 0945, the last Japanese aircraft were departing the target area. Commander Fuchida circled over Pearl Harbor, assessing damage and counting ships. What he saw exceeded the most optimistic expectations. All 8 battleships present had been hit. Arizona and Oklahoma were total losses. West Virginia and California were sinking at their moorings. Nevada was beached. The others were damaged to varying degrees. 3 destroyers and several other vessels were sunk or heavily damaged. Over 180 American aircraft had been destroyed, most caught on the ground. It appeared to be a victory of historic proportions. The flight back to the carrier saw the attack force's only significant losses. Several damaged aircraft ditched in the ocean when they couldn't make it back. In total, Japan lost 29 aircraft from both waves, 9 fighters, 15 dive bombers, and 5 torpedo bombers. 65 airmen had been killed or captured. Against the apparent devastation inflicted, these losses seemed trivial. Aboard the returning aircraft, pilots and aircrew felt the elation of professional warriors who had executed a complex operation with precision. Yet aboard the Akagi, as Fuchida landed and made his report to Admiral Nagumo, a crucial debate began. Fuchida and Commander Minoru Genda, the operation's tactical architect, urged an immediate third wave. The fuel tanks, they argued, were still intact. The repair facilities were largely untouched. The submarine base had barely been scratched. Most crucially, the American carriers, though absent from the harbor, needed to be hunted down and destroyed. This was the moment to press the advantage, to turn a tactical triumph into strategic catastrophe for the Americans. Nagumo refused. His caution, bred from years of surface warfare doctrine, reasserted itself. The element of surprise was gone. American carriers might be closing on his position. His own ships were in enemy waters, vulnerable to counterattack. The mission objectives, destroying the American battleship force, had been achieved. The risks of remaining in the area, he judged, outweighed potential gains. At 1300 hours, he gave the order to withdraw. The Kido Butai turned north, racing away from Hawaii at maximum speed. The voyage back to Japan took on a character entirely different from the tense approach. Aboard the carriers, crews celebrated what appeared to be an unprecedented victory. Commander Fuchida compiled his after-action reports, detailing the destruction of Battleship Row with professional satisfaction. The pilots who had flown through anti-aircraft fire and returned safely felt the euphoria of survival mixed with the pride of accomplished warriors. Messages of congratulation from Tokyo began arriving, praising the attack force for their historic achievement. Yet not everyone shared the celebratory mood. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports at the combined fleet headquarters in Hiroshima Bay, recognized immediately what others could not yet see. The American carriers had escaped. The fuel tanks and repair facilities remained operational. Most crucially, contrary to his hopes, the attack had not resulted in any overtures for negotiation from Washington. Instead, early intercepts suggested American fury, not demoralization. Yamamoto reportedly remarked to his staff that they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve, though historians debate whether he actually used these specific words. The strategic calculation underlying Pearl Harbor was already unraveling, though most Japanese officers couldn't yet perceive it. Japan's plan envisioned a defensive perimeter stretching from the Kurils through Wake Island, the Marshalls, and New Guinea to Burma. American attacks against this fortress would be repelled with heavy losses until war weariness drove Washington to negotiate. But this strategy rested on assumptions about American psychology that Yamamoto knew were flawed. The Japanese High Command had mistaken isolationist sentiment for weakness, unwillingness to fight European wars for inability to sustain any war. As the Kido Butai steamed northward, the broader Japanese offensive was unfolding across the Pacific and Asia. Simultaneous with the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese forces struck the Philippines, Malaya, and Hong Kong. These operations proceeded with the same precision and success as the Hawaiian attack. British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk by Japanese naval aviation on December 10th, sending shockwaves through Western military establishments. Wake Island would fall on December 23rd after fierce resistance. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. The southern operation, to seize the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, was proceeding ahead of schedule. For Japan's military and political leadership, these victories seemed to validate the decision for war. In Tokyo, the Tojo cabinet received news of Pearl Harbor with satisfaction. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had ascended to power in October 1941 partly on his reputation as a hardliner, saw the attack as the decisive stroke that would secure Japan's empire. The Diet, dominated by militarists and their allies, approved declarations of war against the United States and Britain with near unanimity. Public reaction, carefully managed by government censors, appeared jubilant. The Kido Butai reached Japanese waters on December 23rd, met by cheering crowds at Kura Naval Base. The pilots were feted as heroes. Commander Fuchida found himself celebrated in newspapers and newsreels. The attack force's losses, 29 aircraft, 1 large submarine, 5 midget submarines, and 65 men, seemed almost miraculously light. Naval planners had anticipated losses of 30 to 40%. The apparent success of the operation seemed to validate the entire strategy of carrier aviation and confirm Japan's technological and tactical superiority. But beneath the celebrations, logistical realities were already asserting themselves. Japan's oil reserves, despite the conquest of the Dutch East Indies still in progress, would never prove adequate to sustain the empire's ambitions. The nation's industrial capacity was approximately 10% that of the United States. Steel production, aircraft production, shipbuilding. In every category, Japan was outmatched by an order of magnitude. The war would be decided not by samurai spirit or tactical brilliance but by industrial output and resources. Furthermore, the nature of the Pearl Harbor attack had psychological consequences the Japanese high command failed to anticipate. The strike, launched before any declaration of war was delivered, was perceived by Americans as a treacherous act of betrayal. This perception, whether entirely fair or not given the complex diplomatic situation, unified American public opinion in a way nothing else could have. Isolationist sentiment evaporated overnight. On December 8th, President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war, calling December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. The vote was near unanimous, with only one dissenting voice in the House of Representatives. The Japanese government attempted to argue that diplomatic communications had broken down, that the attack was meant to coincide with the formal severance of negotiations. But whether through bureaucratic incompetence or deliberate timing, the Japanese embassy in Washington failed to deliver the declaration before the attack commenced. The historical record suggests this was largely due to delays in transcribing and decoding the lengthy diplomatic message, but the effect was the same. To Americans, Pearl Harbor represented not merely an attack, but a sneak attack, confirming racist stereotypes about Japanese duplicity that would poison the Pacific War with particular venom. The months following Pearl Harbor saw Japanese forces achieve victories that seemed to confirm the empire's martial prowess. By February 1942, Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress in Southeast Asia, had fallen after a campaign of barely 70 days. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Army had defeated larger British, Indian, and Australian forces through superior tactics and aggressive maneuver warfare. The capture of Singapore, with approximately 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops, represented the largest surrender in British military history. The Philippines campaign proceeded with similar success. Despite fierce resistance from American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur, Japanese troops under Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma steadily advanced. MacArthur's evacuation to Australia in March 1942 left behind forces that would fight desperately but hopelessly on Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. The final surrender came in May, delivering the Philippines into Japanese hands. The Dutch East Indies, the oil-rich prize that had been a primary objective of the entire war, fell between January and March 1942. The Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, though fighting bravely, couldn't withstand the coordinated assaults. The oil fields of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java passed into Japanese control, theoretically solving Japan's critical resource shortage. Burma fell by May 1942, cutting the Burma Road and severing the supply line to nationalist China. For Japan's military command, this period represented the apex of confidence. In approximately 6 months, forces of the Rising Sun had conquered territories containing over 100 million people and vast natural resources. The defensive perimeter envisioned in pre-war planning had been established ahead of schedule and with fewer losses than anticipated. British, Dutch, and American colonial power in Asia appeared shattered. The racist ideology that had helped drive Japanese expansion, the concept of an Asia for Asians under Japanese leadership, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, seemed vindicated by military success. Commander Fuchida, promoted and decorated for his Pearl Harbor leadership, participated in the Indian Ocean raid of April 1942. The same carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor attacked British bases in Ceylon, sinking the carrier Hermes and several other ships. British naval power in the eastern Indian Ocean effectively ceased to exist. Japan controlled the waters from Tokyo to Madagascar, from the Aleutians to Australia's doorstep. Yet even at this moment of triumph, the foundations of Japan's empire were crumbling. The conquered territories were too vast, the supply lines too extended, the resources too difficult to extract and transport to Japan. The brutal occupation policies implemented by Japanese forces, policies marked by atrocities that ranged from the systematic use of comfort women to massacres of civilians, created resistance that tied down troops needed elsewhere. The promise of Asian liberation rang hollow when delivered at bayonet point. More immediately threatening, American industrial power was mobilizing. President Roosevelt had called for the production of 60,000 aircraft in 1942 alone, a figure Japanese planners dismissed as propaganda. It wasn't. American shipyards were laying down keels for Essex-class fleet carriers at a rate Japan couldn't match. The Liberty ship program was producing cargo vessels faster than submarines could sink them. Pilot training programs were graduating thousands of aviators. The American war machine, its vast potential long dormant, was awakening. The first sign of changing fortunes came in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. For the first time, a Japanese offensive was turned back. The carrier Shoho was sunk, and Shokaku was damaged. Though the Americans lost the carrier Lexington, the Japanese invasion force bound for Port Moresby, New Guinea, was forced to withdraw. It was the first Japanese reverse of the war, small but significant. Then came Midway. June 4, 1942, arrived with Admiral Yamamoto's grandest plan yet in motion. The Midway operation aimed to draw out and destroy the American carrier force that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor. By seizing Midway Atoll, Japan would extend its defensive perimeter and force the Americans into a decisive battle on Japanese terms. Yamamoto commanded the largest naval force yet assembled, including 8 carriers, 11 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Commander Fuchida should have led the airstrike on Midway, reprising his Pearl Harbor role. Instead, he lay in a hospital ship's sick bay, recovering from an emergency appendectomy. From his bed, he would learn of the disaster that befell the Kido Butai on that June day. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 4 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, were at the bottom of the Pacific. Japanese naval aviation, the elite force that had dominated the early months of war, had been gutted in a single day's battle. The details of the Battle of Midway revealed how the tide had turned. American codebreakers had provided advance warning of Japanese intentions. American carriers waited in ambush rather than sailing blindly into a trap. The Japanese, overconfident and divided between attacking Midway and preparing to fight the American carriers, were caught at the worst possible moment. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown struck when the Japanese carriers' decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed. Within 5 minutes, 3 carriers were burning. Hiryu launched a counterattack that would doom Yorktown, but was herself caught and destroyed hours later. The losses weren't merely material. Aboard those 4 carriers went many of the pilots and aircrew who had trained for years and fought throughout the opening campaigns. Japan's pilot training program, unlike America's, couldn't replace these men. The nation lacked the resources, the training capacity, and increasingly, the time. Future Japanese pilots would receive progressively less training, going into combat with skills inferior to those they faced. For Japanese forces throughout the Pacific, Midway marked the beginning of a long, grinding retreat. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The battle for that insignificant island would consume 6 months and exhaust both sides, but ultimately American persistence prevailed. Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, a bitter defeat disguised as strategic withdrawal. Admiral Yamamoto tried desperately to reverse the tide. In April 1943, he personally flew to the Solomon Islands to boost morale. American codebreakers intercepted his itinerary. On April 18th, His aircraft was ambushed by American fighters and shot down over Bougainville Island. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the admiral who had warned that war with America was folly, was dead. His death was kept secret for weeks. So devastating was it to Japanese morale. The pattern that would characterize the rest of the war was now established. American forces would advance across the Pacific in two directions. General MacArthur's forces would island hop through New Guinea toward the Philippines. Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific campaign would seize islands needed for bases to support the advance on Japan itself. Each battle followed a similar pattern. Fierce Japanese resistance, often to the last man, followed by American victory purchased with heavy casualties, but sustainable given American resources. For the Japanese military, the strategy evolved from seeking victory to seeking an honorable stalemate. The concept of decisive battle that had animated pre-war planning, the idea that one great fleet engagement would decide the war, as Tsushima had decided the Russo-Japanese War, proved elusive. The Americans refused to cooperate, instead pursuing a methodical strategy that leveraged their industrial advantage. Japanese propaganda worked desperately to maintain public support. Defeats were portrayed as strategic withdrawals. The growing American bombing campaign, which would devastate Japanese cities, was described as American barbarism, proving Japanese racial superiority, even in adversity. The concept of gyokusai, fighting to the last man, death before surrender, became increasingly prominent. Suicide tactics, initially improvised, became institutionalized in the kamikaze units that first appeared in the Philippines campaign of late 1944. Commander Fuchida survived the war, though his days of leading attacks were over after Midway. He participated in various staff roles, witnessing from the inside as Japan's strategic situation deteriorated from dire to hopeless. The empire that had seemed invincible in early 1942 was being systematically dismantled by the forces whose Pacific Fleet had been crippled on that December morning 2.5 years earlier. By early 1945, the question was no longer whether Japan would lose, but how the war would end. The Philippines had been liberated in battles of savage intensity. Iwo Jima fell in March after 36 days of combat that cost nearly 7,000 American lives and virtually all 21,000 Japanese defenders. Okinawa, the first home island, was invaded in April. The battle for Okinawa would last 82 days and cost over 12,000 American deaths and approximately 100,000 Japanese military deaths, along with tens of thousands of Okinawan civilian casualties. Japan's cities were being systematically destroyed by American B-29 bombers flying from bases in the Marianas. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9–10, 1945, killed approximately 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. Over 60 other cities suffered similar attacks. Japan's wooden cities proved terribly vulnerable to incendiary weapons. The naval blockade by American submarines had strangled Japanese shipping, creating food shortages even as military production collapsed. Yet the Japanese government, controlled by militarists who had led the nation into war, would not surrender. The concept of honorable peace remained a chimera, as the Allies demanded unconditional surrender and seemed intent on trying Emperor Hirohito as a war criminal. To Japan's leadership, raised in the Bushido tradition, surrender was disgrace worse than death. Plans were prepared for Ketsugo, the decisive battle for Japan itself. Civilians, including women and children, were trained with bamboo spears to resist the expected invasion. Thousands of aircraft were hoarded for kamikaze attacks against invasion fleets. Commander Fuchida was in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. He had traveled there for meetings at the Second Army headquarters. By chance or providence, he was called away to Navy headquarters on Itajima Island in Hiroshima Bay. From that island, he witnessed a flash brighter than the sun, followed by a mushroom cloud rising over the city. Hiroshima had ceased to exist, vaporized by a weapon Fuchida couldn't comprehend. When he returned to the city days later, searching for friends, he walked through a landscape of apocalyptic destruction. 3 days after Hiroshima, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito spoke directly to the Japanese people for the first time, his voice broadcast by radio. The war, he announced, had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The nation must endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. Japan would surrender. For men like Fuchida, the emperor's announcement brought emotions impossible to articulate. Relief that the dying would stop mixed with shame at defeat and uncertainty about the future. The concept of living with defeat, of surrender, clashed with everything they had been taught. Some officers committed suicide rather than face occupation. The attempted coup by die-hard officers on August 14th failed only because key army leaders refused to support it. The formal surrender ceremony occurred on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General MacArthur accepted the Japanese surrender, witnessed by representatives of all the Allied nations Japan had fought. Among the American battleships present was the USS West Virginia, sunk at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, raised, repaired, and returned to service. The symbolism was intentional and unmistakable. For Japan, the war that began at Pearl Harbor ended in complete devastation. Approximately 3 million Japanese had died, roughly half of them civilians. Virtually every major city except Kyoto had been bombed. The empire was dissolved, with Japan reduced to its home islands, occupied by foreign troops for the first time in its history. The military was disbanded, the divine emperor retained but reduced to symbolic status. The Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates were broken up. Democracy was imposed by the occupiers, written into a constitution that included Article 9, forbidding Japan from maintaining military forces. Commander Fuchida's post-war journey took an unexpected turn. Disillusioned and searching for meaning in defeat, he converted to Christianity in 1949 after encountering an American missionary. He spent the rest of his life as an evangelist, traveling the United States and speaking about his experiences. His wartime role made him a controversial figure, but he insisted that his conversion was genuine, driven by the contrast between the Japanese militarism that had led to disaster and the Christian message of forgiveness and redemption. Pearl Harbor's legacy extended far beyond the military outcomes. For the United States, December 7, 1941, became a symbol of vigilance against surprise attack, invoked repeatedly throughout the Cold War and again after September 11, 2001. For Japan, the war that began with Pearl Harbor became a cautionary tale about militarism and the consequences of imperial ambition. The phrase, "never again," took on particular meaning in a nation that had experienced atomic weapons. From the Japanese perspective, Pearl Harbor represented both tactical brilliance and strategic catastrophe. The attack achieved unprecedented surprise and inflicted devastating damage, but it awakened a nation with 10 times Japan's industrial capacity and transformed a divided America into a united juggernaut bent on total victory. Admiral Yamamoto's fears proved prophetic. Japan ran wild for 6 months, perhaps slightly longer, but the second and third years brought steady defeat, then collapse, then destruction on a scale that made Pearl Harbor seem like a minor skirmish. The irony was not lost on those who survived. They had struck the first blow with such precision and power that it seemed to guarantee victory. Instead, that very blow ensured their ultimate defeat. The sleeping giant had awakened, and his terrible resolve consumed the empire of the rising sun.